To everyone who's just joined, you are in the right place. This is al-Qaeda, Evergreen Threat, or Yesterday's Fight. We are giving people a couple more minutes to join, so just bear with us for a moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Quincy Institute's panel, al-Qaeda, Evergreen Threat, or Yesterday's Fight. Of course, al-Qaeda has served as the principal enemy of the US war on terror that was launched after 9/11. And today we're going to engage in an informal debate and discussion about what degree that threat should still be prioritized. And if you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we're a DC-based think tank that prioritizes a US foreign policy that is more restraint-oriented and relies more heavily on engagement with the world through diplomacy and development rather than military intervention. And we have a great lineup today, and I'm going to give a brief version of their biographies, but you can go to the landing page if you want to learn more about them. We have Dr. Tricia Bacon, who is an assistant professor at the American University School of Public Affairs, where she directs the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub, and she also brings government experience of over a decade at the State Department, working for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, Bureau of Counterterrorism, and Bureau of Diplomatic Security. She's the author of Why Terrorist Organizations Form International Alliances, and a more recent book about leadership called Terror and Transition, Leadership and Succession in Terrorist Organizations, that's coming out September, so look out for that. Next up, we have Dr. Dan Byman, who is a professor in Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, and he's a senior fellow at Brookings, and he's also the foreign policy editor at Lawfare. He too comes with government experience, and he served as a staff member with the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the United States, also known as the 9/11 Commission, and the joint 9/11 inquiry staff of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And last but not least, we have Asfandyar Amir, Dr. Asfandyar Amir, who is a senior expert at the United States Institute of Peace. He was previously at Stanford, and he is known as one of the preeminent experts on al-Qaeda, especially in South Asia. So we're going to jump right into the questions here. For a little bit of background, though, Asfandyar and Dan recently wrote two pieces. One was a journal article, and one was a shorter piece in War on the Rocks, in which they debate whether US policy should continue to prioritize al-Qaeda as a threat, as we have over the last 20 years of the war on terror. And in short, and we're going to go much deeper into this, Asfandyar argues that al-Qaeda is still very much a formidable threat that the United States should prioritize. And Dan says not so much. Their capacity is reduced, and there are bigger threats that we should focus on. That's the 30,000-foot overview of the argument. There's a lot more nuance to it. So let's get started. Dan, why don't you just tell us where you think al-Qaeda falls on the spectrum of risks that the US government has to care about?
So there's always a question with terrorism, which is how to balance the direct loss of life with the broader psychological impact that these attacks have. And al-Qaeda, and especially its affiliates, still has some capacity to do attacks. But in my judgment, these are greatly diminished, whether we're comparing it to the period before 9/11 or the years that immediately follow. It hasn't done, the Corps certainly hasn't done significant attacks in the United States or in Europe for many years. And the affiliates have been more active, but even they have been less than many people feared. And the overall death toll, especially in the US homeland, is quite limited. And in my view, because of this, the United States can focus in part on other terrorism threats, but also on a range of very dangerous and pressing global challenges. And to be clear, this isn't one of these don't focus at all sort of arguments. It's simply a question of the considerable resources the United States has devoted to al-Qaeda. At least some of them can be directed elsewhere, and some of them should continue, but don't need to be greatly accelerated.
Okay, thanks for that. And Asfandyar, I'm going to give you a brief rebuttal. Why do you think, as you've argued, that al-Qaeda is still very much a threat that the US should be focused on?
Uh, right. Thanks for convening this, Adam. Great to be on this panel with you, Dan, and Trisha, and really looking forward to the conversation. So as you note, my assessment is that al-Qaeda is a significant and enduring problem. And my read is rooted in the fact that despite being, one of the most hunted, or in fact, the most hunted organizations in the world over the last 20 years, al-Qaeda is still able to meaningfully threaten the US homeland, broader US security interests, as well as regional stability in Africa, more significantly, but also to an extent in South Asia, and perhaps less so in the Middle East than in the past. And Dan and I, we've been discussing this, debating this. Trisha has also been a part of these conversations, of the broader debate. But our discussion on this issue, I think we turn to different variables in how we read this threat, and to an extent, we also focus on different time periods. Our judgments vary on the time periods we should be looking at as the right point of comparison. My big point is that al-Qaeda's political trajectory really needs to be seen in the light of the constraints facing the group as the most hunted organization of the US government, the international community at large. And my view is that it should, it is diminished in some ways, but it should be even more diminished given some of the pressure that has been exerted against this group. And so given that, the fact that al-Qaeda remains committed in its political ambition of fighting the United States while simultaneously embedding itself in some crucial regional contexts, that is a vital sign of the threat to me. And for which reason I think it needs to be taken seriously. Again, I'm not saying that al-Qaeda needs to be the top problem, far from it, but still I think there are compelling reasons to be taking this threat more seriously than the current trajectory implied by some of the strategic debates on prioritization we're having in Washington, D.C. these days.
So I want to talk about something you said, which is you really focused on the intent of al-Qaeda, and in your writings, you focus on their continued focus on Western targets, even as they branch out into the region, and the fact that they pretty much continually state that they want to strike the United States. And because of those statements, they've been subjected to, a very intense counterterrorism campaign for 20 years. And if they were pragmatic and they were to sort of reduce the scope of their ambition, they might be deprioritized and actually face less pressure. And you essentially argue that, hey, look at the fact that they're willing to really face this kind of CT pressure by not altering their stated intent. And that's evidence of where they want to go. And so I guess my question to you would be, so what? They're ideologues. Of course, they have grandiose intentions. Of course, they say they want to strike the West. Their threat calculation and their risk calculation is not necessarily rooted in realpolitik, because they are ideologues and they are willing to lose top leadership. And they are willing to subject themselves to drone strikes, and they are willing to subject themselves to high casualties among their rank and file and be hunted down around the world. So why should we care about what their intent is? Shouldn't we, take Dan's approach and really focus on their actual capacity, regardless of what their intent is?
Right. So, I would, love to hear Trisha's take on this, as well as, Dan's counterposition. We've been discussing this. But when it comes to terror groups, my inclination is to take intent, direction, as well as the level of resolve in intent and the direction of a terror actor very seriously. And that's because terrorism by design is a game. It's a strategy of the weaker actor. So the weaker actor is, for the most part, always going to not have the requisite capacity for whatever aims it is intending to achieve. And so for that reason, I think intent tells us where capacity can sort of go, even in times when a political actor looks relatively weak. And Al-Qaeda today is in that state where it's unclear what exactly its capacity is, from a distance at least. If you're not a day-to-day follower, it can be a little bit puzzling as to what is the exact capacity and capability of Al-Qaeda, in particular as the group has adapted to USCT pressure. And for that reason, I think we should be paying a lot of attention to intent and resolve, because that is the more important, more useful indicator for the kind of capability that Al-Qaeda can acquire. The other argument I'll make is that I think we need to stop dismissing all of Al-Qaeda's sort of intent discussion as just cheap talk and propaganda. I think in the past, Al-Qaeda has delivered on some of its provocations. And so I take some cue from that. This is not just a group of ideologues. When they make threats, they tend to follow through on them, at least try to follow through on them. And therefore, we should be taking them at their word somewhat seriously.
Trisha, I'd like to bring you in. First, I'd like you to react to what extent we should be taking Al-Qaeda at its word versus looking at them from the perspective of whether they have the capacity to carry out their word or not. And secondly, a key point of contention, I think, between Dan and Asfandyar, if you read their paper, is the reason behind Al-Qaeda's regionalization and its shift from a very centralized organization to one that partners with other terrorist outfits in the region and sort of co-opts them. So the first question, I guess, would be how much should intent matter to US policymakers? And the second question is, should the United States be worried about Al-Qaeda's spread into different parts of the world, or is this actually a result of the weakening of Al-Qaeda and the fact that it has to seek the protection of regional power brokers?
Sure. No, it's a really useful and important debate. And both Dan and Asfandyar make great points for consideration. I think when I ask myself the question of how important Al-Qaeda is, what I'm actually thinking about is how important is the Sunni jihadist movement overall as a threat to the United States? I'm not sure that I would think it's as beneficial to disaggregate sort of organization by organization, because what we see within the movement writ large is that some actors become weak and others are able to find opportunities in that to gain strength, or we think an organization is defeated, which has happened on more than one occasion in the last 20 years, and they come sort of roaring back with a vengeance in ways that were not seen beforehand. So I think I asked that question more broadly. I think we have two organizations competing for leadership of the movement in the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda who are both grappling with losses. And one of the questions that I have is who is going to be able to recover enough to sort of regain a definitive mantle of leadership of the movement. And I think one of the ways that Al-Qaeda would seek to do so would be to conduct some kind of significant attack in the West. I do think that it lacks the capability to do that at this juncture, but I agree with Asfandyar that intent is what drives capability. And not entirely, a group can want to do something and can't gain the capability, but for a lot of organizations, that's how they decide what they're going to do in terms of building their capability. So I would take intent seriously. And I think intent becomes even more serious when a group has a safe haven, because that does provide some breathing room to build capability, which is, of course, the situation that we find Al-Qaeda in now. I also think that we tend to speak about capability a little bit too broadly. When I was in the intelligence community, there would be questions about whether a group had the capability to strike the United States, the Pakistani Taliban being a prime example. And the assessment was no, it didn't have the capability to do that. And then an American appeared in its training camps and it almost detonated a bomb in Times Square. So there's also a range of capability, 9/11 style organized capability to more opportunistic capability. And that is much harder to predict from a capability standpoint. And is still something that we have to sort of grapple with when we think about a group like Al-Qaeda, where we have such limited visibility into what the group is doing now.
You mentioned something that I think is interesting, which is that we should look at this Sunni jihadist threat comprehensively rather than disaggregating it and focusing on one group or another. And the reason I find that interesting is because I think there has been a focus in US counterterrorism to completely defeat one group. And then in the process of doing that, another group rises up. And, of course, if our goal is to reduce the terrorist threat to zero, we're going to be pursuing that indefinitely, especially if we apply a maximalist approach and just pour resources into it. And so actually for this question, I'd like to bring Dan in, because Dan, you've argued that the US needs to get a little bit more comfortable with the unknown and uncertainty and risk, and that we've been pouring resources into the counterterrorism fight against al-Qaeda, and whether correctly or incorrectly, we've given ourselves the perception that we've reduced risk, but it's not sustainable, and that US counterterrorism policy is just going to have to get comfortable with the unknown. Can you expand on what you mean by that?
Sure. And let me begin by saying, I think the way Tricia is describing the terrorism threat is the right way to think about it. Esfandiar and I did focus on al-Qaeda for our piece, but when we're thinking about policy, it's overall dangers rather than, I don't think it would be any comfort to Americans or people around the world to say, oh, that terrorist attack wasn't by al-Qaeda, so that's good news, right? If they're going to care about the attack, not about the particulars of the group. But I would say two things on the risk question. So point number one, I think the risk is greatly reduced from where it was. And as you've heard me argue, I believe that not only is al-Qaeda less dangerous, but I also think the Islamic State has been hit very hard in the last 6 years. And as a result, the movement as a whole is much weaker. And you do still have individuals who might be inspired. It's not a completely zero danger, but because the major groups are diminished, actually the movement as a whole follows as well. And that's in part because the groups are capable not only of better operations, but also of sophisticated propaganda, of inspiring people. And when you see defeat after defeat, lots of problems, it's harder to generate enthusiasm. There are very few 20-year-olds who are looking around the jihadist world who say, oh, I'm so excited that the Islamic State is getting severely mauled in places like Syria. I want to go join that. So it diminishes its appeal. But the broader question is, what is the level of terrorism danger the United States is willing to accept? And right after 9/11, it seemed like the answer was zero. But over time, there's been a recognition in practice, although not in rhetoric, that there's going to be some terrorist group activity in different places around the world. And the United States might try to tamp that down through a mix of intelligence cooperation or training of allied military forces. But it's not going to be everywhere all the time. And as a result, there may be problems or surprises. So one thing, and I'll put this on Esfandiar's side of our debate, is Yemen, where if you go back 15 years ago, Yemen was a much more localized threat. They had international elements, but it was very focused on the region. And then a couple of years later, the branch there began to do international terrorist attacks. And we will see some surprises because this movement is exceptionally difficult to predict. And I think we have to accept that at times, intelligence is going to be fallible and there will be limits. A big question to watch today, and Tricia really is an expert on this, is Somalia, where you have a group that is far more international and active than it was 5 years ago, and does pose some dangers, which is why the Biden administration has plussed up military capacity there. But overall, in my view, American leaders need to accept that we're simply not going to be everywhere all the time. And what that means is occasionally there will be intelligence mistakes, occasionally terrorists will slip through the net, and that's horrible. But the alternative of expending resources all around the world and still often failing also is not a good alternative. And there's simply too many other priorities in the world today to be focused, to be making the al-Qaeda threat in particular, but the jihadist threat one of the very top.
So on the topic of spending resources all around the world and still failing, I want to go back to an incident that Tricia mentioned, which was Faisal Shahzad, who had gone to train with the TTP in Pakistan. He was a Pakistani American, and then came back to the United States and attempted to detonate a bomb in Times Square and failed. And I guess this is a question for everyone, but I'll start with Trisha. I mean, here's a group we're not paying attention to, the TTP. It's at the height of the US surge in Afghanistan. So we have close to 100,000 troops in Afghanistan at that time. And, this man still manages to do this, come back to the United States. But he's not very professional. He does a sloppy execution and he manages to fail at his task. I mean, in some sense, one, how do you really stop a lone wolf like that? And in a second sense, is engaging in the kind of boots on the ground counterterrorism that we have for the last 20 years really the way to go about that? I mean, it seems to me that the only two ways we would have really stopped him was, through Homeland Security back home or through shared intelligence with the Pakistanis abroad, not necessarily through having thousands of US troops in Afghanistan or trying to pursue the Taliban or al-Qaeda. So how do you think we deal with this phenomenon of lone wolf attacks that might be inspired by al-Qaeda or groups like ISIS?
Well, in the case of the TTP, it really never was a US boots on the ground approach to the organization, right? This is in Fatah and Pakistan, and the Pakistanis were certainly not interested in us having that kind of presence. So this was very much sort of a drone pressure with some Pakistani operations. And frankly, just at a basic, I don't think there's any appetite for those kinds of military interventions anymore. I think that's not even sort of a question as a counterterrorism analyst that I'm considering, because that is not where the political environment was. So even if I was advocating for it, which I'm not, I think that is just no longer really an option on the table, because this has been eclipsed by other national security issues, which I would say I don't disagree with. I just think there still is very much strength in the Sunni jihadist movement, but in places where the US has traditionally ignored it, like Africa, where we've seen an exponential increase in jihadism. In places we never would have imagined 20 years ago when I was working on Africa that we would see it. And I think that I have some concern about the US neglect of Africa in this context. And I think that ultimately that will be a policy mistake, but that is not to say that I think it's more important than great power competition, or that I think we should deploy thousands and thousands of troops. But if an amateur sort of American can go to Pakistan, try to join the Taliban, end up in a TTP camp, manage to get home, acquire all those materials, there were intervention points there. And I wouldn't say he was a lone wolf, because he was being remotely sort of guided by the TTP. I think real lone wolves are really, really rare. And you're right, though, when they do occur, a genuine lone wolf, there's a limit to what can be done unless the people in their lives give some kind of tip or alert the authorities to some kind of strange behavior.
So thanks for that,
Adam.
Sorry.
If I can just jump in on the Fetz versus Azad example, and to make a point about the importance of US CT pressure, which comes in different forms, sort of unilateral activity as well as through partners and countries in the region. So one big reason he failed in his attempt to blow up Times Square in New York was because he was poorly trained. And the reason he was poorly trained was that there was a lot of US drone loitering in the area where he was at in northwestern Pakistan, Pakistani tribal areas, and due to the fear of being targeted, his master trainers were not able to train him, and so that translated in his inability to put together the bomb materials and do a lot of damage, a decade back, and so that gets at the importance of sustaining some of this pressure and what it yields, for the security of the U.S. homeland, as well as the security of at least U.S. allies. You're able to keep these threats off balance, and that has some real benefits and advantages.
Trisha, I don't think you've gotten to speak about your area expertise in East Africa. You touched on it. So based on, jumping off on what Asfandyar just said, what is the benefit of keeping these groups off balance when they're in their early stages of spreading or developing? And do you think these regional affiliates of al-Qaeda have the same transnational ambitions that al-Qaeda does, or are they actually truly localized and locally focused?
I think you make an important point there, which is that dealing with these emerging threats early is much better than trying to counter them once they're entrenched. And in Africa, you see a number of these organizations at different stages, from relatively nascent to basically quasi-states. So we have kind of a range of the threats there, most of which are allied with either the Islamic State or al-Qaeda. So I do think that this is one of those areas where interventions now could save a lot of lives and resources later. But more broadly, I think that in the case of all affiliates, Islamic State and al-Qaeda alike, there is more of a local and parochial focus, I think. But I also think it's a false dichotomy. I think that a lot of these organizations do both. They prioritize one. I think in the case of al-Shabaab, in part, its efforts against the United States are a reflection of how it's trying to counter US pressure in the region, but it also engaged in what I would almost call a TTP or Pakistani Taliban style effort in deploying an operative to go get flight training, right? So it indicates some willingness to engage in transnational plotting, but not prioritizing it in a way that they're using their main resources and capability. So I think that for a lot of the affiliates, there is some nod towards the transnational ambitions, and they even see the United States as somewhat behind some of their particular political problems, while the bulk of their focus tends to be either local or regional, but they can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I'm not comfortable just saying they're sort of local, we don't need to worry about them. But I do think that they're primarily focused at a more local level.
So if we could do an overview right now of what's been said, I think it's safe to say that all of you think that al-Qaeda still presents some form of threat. All of you have disavowed a return to the era of 100,000 boots on the ground or 20,000 boots on the ground that dominated the global war on terrorism. And I think it's important to note that in the journal article that Dan and Asfandyar co-wrote, both of them agreed that regime change actually creates space and opportunity for terrorist organizations and should be avoided as a matter of US foreign policy. But listening to Asfandyar and Trisha, both of you seem to think that there's still a need for something in between deprioritizing al-Qaeda and engaging in the kind of counterterrorism we did for the last 20 years, that there needs to be some middle path that, you use the word interventions. Whereas when I read what you've written, Dan, you seem to very much think that there should be a significant deprioritization of al-Qaeda versus other threats, at least much more significant than what Asfandyar and Trisha would advocate for. And so I'd like to ask you kind of again, where does that position come from?
So when we think about policymaking, it's always easy to say we should pay more attention to really everything, right? And if we were having a panel on, Guinea-Bissau or Ecuador, we would say we should really be paying more attention to these parts of the world, and they would benefit from resources and senior policy attention, and that's all true. But of course, whether it's the president or Secretary of State or the military, only have so many resources. And it's a tough world out there. And that can be whether it's Russia or China or COVID, or also even if you look at the greater Middle East. In my view, there are other things that should be ahead of counterterrorism. And I say this as someone who works on counterterrorism and believes very strongly that a lot of the successes the United States has had have been in part because of kind of very effective efforts by impressive government people. And the shift to Africa that Asfandyar and Trisha talk about, to me, is a very important issue, which is these groups there are primarily a threat to the stability of parts of Africa. And I have no problem with military training or intelligence cooperation or relatively low resource efforts to improve stability in these regions. But at the same time, the United States historically has not considered the vast majority of Africa to be a strategic priority. And that's in contrast to when it looked like al-Qaeda was a menace to Saudi Arabia in the early 2000s. And that was always considered an important priority for the United States. And when we saw al-Qaeda do significant attacks on the US or European homelands, those were considered priorities. So when we think about the primary dangers, I tend to think in terms of, of terrorist attacks on countries the United States cares most about, instability from jihadist-backed insurgencies in critical regions. And while there's certainly still some degree of risk, in my view, it's significantly lower than it was 20 years ago. And meanwhile, other challenges have arisen. And I think we can shift resources to some degree without a huge loss of protection for what matters most.
I want to follow up on that quickly, because you're talking about where we prioritize this in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but I want to step back even further and just talk about the threats all Americans face. There's someone in the chat who writes that it's almost amusing to hear a discussion of the degree to which the U.S. is concerned with terrorists from outside the country when I think of how it's willing to accept internal terrorism, mass shootings, et cetera. And I mention that because I think it's something that doesn't get discussed a lot among foreign policy, folks. But it is something that I hear from a lot of Americans, which is, and it's something I even wonder myself. I mean, okay, let's just assume that al-Qaeda is capable of striking the homeland. Let's assume that there's a significant risk that in the next 5 years, al-Qaeda could achieve a mass casualty attack within the borders of the United States. Let's just say it could kill 100 people. In the grand scheme of things, when a million people have died of COVID, when there's other pandemics that could be even deadlier, when there's shootings by the tens of thousands in this country, when there's a risk of white supremacist terrorism and far-right terrorism, when we're engaged in a drug war and there's a drug epidemic, when we have an infrastructure crisis. I mean, look at the collapse of the apartment building that occurred in Florida, which has been forgotten, but if that had been the result of a terrorist attack, it would dominate the discourse to this day. When we look at the threat of al-Qaeda within, and we put it up against all those other risks that Americans face, and in some sense, one dead American is one dead American, I can't help but think that the only reason to truly focus on al-Qaeda might be psychological in nature, and that we, as policymakers who are also humans, place a disproportionate focus on outside threats rather than the internal threats and risks that we could actually better control. If I could get a reaction from all of you on that, because I think this is something that a lot of Americans, think in the back of their head.
Let me start off, and I look forward to my colleagues. Certainly, just from an accounting point of view, the number of deaths from terrorism in the last 20 years has been quite small. And while it's quite plausible that while this webinar is going on, that more Americans may die from COVID than will die from al-Qaeda attacks this year, right? So if you simply are adding up numbers, I think that's reasonable. But there's no question, for better or worse, that terrorism matters from a political point of view, and that jihadist terrorism in particular matters because it's more seen as outsiders. And so I recently wrote a book on white supremacist violence, and I'm tremendously concerned about linkages between kind of anti-government extremism and US politics. So my own priorities in watching terrorism have shifted to some degree on this. But if you look at polling, if you look at political reactions, there's no question that people are tremendously concerned about this. And we saw this in the Obama administration, where President Obama tried to play down the threat of terrorism, pointing to numbers and otherwise noting that the risks seem lower, and people simply did not accept it. And politicians have to react to that sentiment, whether it's psychological, whether there's some ingrained racism in terms of fear of Muslims, whatever the issue might be. To expect politicians not to act like politicians in the end is unrealistic. And as a result, policy needs to reflect that to some degree even as I think there must be a broader effort to make it clear to people what the true level of threat is.
And I'd like to go to Asfanjar and Trisha now, but before we do that, because this informs what we're talking about right now, there was an excellent question in the Q&A, which is, if there was an attack on the US homeland by a group like al-Shabaab, would the US government be able to show the restraint to not overreact and repeat an open-ended boots on the ground deployment to a country like Somalia? So as you answered my original question, I think it's also worth considering, is our political system mature enough to react to these threats with any kind of restraint or any kind of kind of rational response in terms of proportionality? Or is there a reason to try to prevent them and perhaps overemphasize prevention simply because an attack would break our political system, kind of the way 9/11 did? So if you could consider that as you respond, maybe Asfanjar, you can add your remarks.
Sure. So I completely agree with Dan here that I think the domestic politics of the US is a big variable, a big reason to retain this focus. And it is indeed maddening when you see a million people dead and children dying in schools from these horrific shootings, that the CT community, which is more outwardly focused, really moves heaven and earth to prevent the next attack, and yet so many people continue to die in these other ways. But it's just a reality that the US is more sensitive to some of this violence by Sunni jihadists, and my concern is higher because of some of the domestic political trends we're seeing, the political polarization in the country, democratic backsliding, economic anxiety. And Sunni jihadists like al-Qaeda, they pay attention to what goes on in the US, and my concern is that they may try to exploit the divisiveness. And in case of a mass casualty attack, I really worry about the second order effects. I think an overreaction, say, against the likes of Shabaab in Somalia is well within the realm of possibilities. So all of this leads me to suggest that I think we should really redouble our efforts at prevention, because that's the best way to prevent some of these terrible pathologies from being unleashed.
I don't have terribly much to add to this. I think that if you asked most counterterrorism analysts whether there is a greater threat from school shootings or COVID than al-Qaeda, they would obviously say that it's COVID and school shootings. I don't think that that's, when you're talking about national security priorities and you're talking about foreign policy, you are sort of, by definition, talking about a subset of issues, right? So I almost think that the policy instruments you use for one are very different than the policy instruments you use for another. So I wouldn't rack and stack the Sunni jihadist movement against those kinds of domestic issues. I'm talking about prioritization of it after China, Russia, but within the scope of foreign policy. So I agree with that point. And I think there has been a move in the counterterrorism, even the counterterrorism analytic community, to focus more on the far right. In the United States, I get asked sort of on a weekly basis if I'm working on that, and Dan has made that is diversified beautifully, but I sort of feel like a dinosaur at times because people still ask me, "You're still working on that?" So I would simply sort of say that it's even a second. Sunni jihadism is even a second tier priority within the counterterrorism, broader counterterrorism community. If al-Shabaab was to succeed at some kind of large scale attack in the United States, we already have somewhat of a presence there. I would expect a strong reaction to that, but I'm not sure I would say that it would be 100,000 boots on the ground trying to install a new government in Somalia. I think the era of that has been is past, at least in the near term, and under sort of the current political environment. That doesn't seem like an investment that's likely to be made, but that doesn't mean there wouldn't be some kind of overreaction in the face of that kind of attack.
So as someone, personally speaking, who believes in a more restrained U.S. foreign policy, who wants to see an end to military intervention, even in small scale form around the world, and wants to see a more diplomacy oriented foreign policy, it really does, what does keep me up at night is this idea that if a terrorist attack were to occur on the homeland, kind of what one of the comments in the Q&A said and what we're discussing now, it really would turn into an irrational national debate. The fact that we have a divisive political system would mean that both parties would compete with one another to be the party of national security, as we've seen in the past, and that it would actually undo any progress that we've made towards having a less militarized foreign policy. But it also feels like there's this chicken and the egg kind of circularity to all of this, in which we talk about, oftentimes in Washington, when a mass shooting happens, for example, I'll hear people say, how can we lead on the world stage when we have, mass shootings at home? And I can't help but think, well, is that really the first concern here? The first concern for me is that we have mass shootings at home. And I agree with you, what you just said, Tricia, that in an ideal world, at least these things should be compartmentalized. We should have domestic priorities and we should have foreign policy priorities, and they shouldn't necessarily be connected. And yet politicians and presidents have limited space on their desks. And I think these things often do get connected, and they certainly get connected in terms of the election cycle. And so it really does become, what threats do politicians prioritize, not based on the severity of the threat itself, but based on what the media and political opposition and a reaction of people on Main Street America is going to be if that threat comes into fruition. And so that's, and Asfanjar, I know you have a whole section in the paper about the fact that al-Qaeda might try to exploit that reality. So I guess, how do we deal with the fact that US policymakers only have so much bandwidth? Tricia, you've said that even in the foreign policy realm, al-Qaeda should be underneath white supremacy. It should be underneath China and Russia and great power competition. I'd argue that climate change is also a foreign policy issue and an existential issue, and that al-Qaeda should be well below that. But it does seem to just take up a disproportionate amount of discussion and bandwidth. If you were to look at congressional hearings about terrorism versus climate change versus infrastructure, even versus great power competition, I mean, it would be a I don't have the figures, but it's uneven. So how do we recalibrate the US foreign policy to discussion to put the al-Qaeda risk in the order it belongs relative to other risks? Does anyone have any ideas?
I guess I would say that I would ask what time frame you're looking in when you talk about the prioritization of it, because my sense is, as someone who primarily follows the Sunni jihadist movement, that reorientation is well underway. I wouldn't say that it is getting more attention. And in the policy circles that I move in, and my former colleagues at the State Department, that is not what I hear either. I hear that great power competition is dominating. We have a special envoy for climate change. Like, I think some of the orientation that you're talking about is well underway under this administration, and maybe even started somewhat under the last administration. So I'm not sure that I would agree with the premise that there is this disproportionate focus on the Sunni jihadist movement anymore. I think it's a focus within the counterterrorism analytic and policy community that works on these issues in the US government, and having that kind of expertise is really important, and making sure you don't lose that expertise as we have a way of shifting personnel around to priorities, and sometimes you can lose some of that. So I would say maintaining that expertise and having that that community that's focused on those issues overseas, is that we're getting closer to the balance that you're saying that we need, and that's at least my perception as someone coming from this community.
Excuse me. So I mean, that's an interesting point, and I guess I'd follow up with what Dan said, which is that, when we talk about different issues in Washington, everyone who focuses on those issues thinks more attention should be paid to their issue. So I guess my follow-up to you would be, how do people who operate in the silo of CT and operate, focus on CT in South Asia, the Middle East, or writ large, advocate for continued vigilance while also accepting the reality that maybe it should be deprioritized compared to, the the focus it had over the last 20 years. Is there a way for specialists to do that? That's for you, Tricia.
I didn't want to be the person who kept answering questions. I think that's right. I think one of the difficulties, and Dan alluded to this earlier, is that we've had this very zero tolerance attitude towards terrorism, and that's extended to the counterterrorism world. Whenever there's an attack, there is an examination of how it happened and what went wrong and finding blame for it. And so there's been a creation of a culture within the counterterrorism realm that you can't have any attacks because it's somebody's fault. And so there's some of it needs to, if there's going to be the kind of recalibration you're talking about, not that it would ever be okay with the counterterrorism community to have missed something or to have had an attack, but after every single attack, there's this after action that places the blame on someone. And so I think that is creates a little bit of dysfunction within the counterterrorism community in adopting the posture that we're advocating here, or that we're discussing here.
I'll add to that. I think Tricia is raising a tremendously important point here, which is the political assumption and the policy assumption is that the number of terrorist attacks must be zero. And if you're saying, as I do, that the United States can take on more risk, you're implicitly saying that there'll be at least a higher probability of a successful terrorist attack. And understandably, I certainly am very uncomfortable saying this, right? This are innocent lives lost, and this is a horrible thing. But it gets to this question of trade-offs and other priorities. And those are very difficult conversations to have. And yet we treat terrorism in a way we don't treat many other policy issues. When we talk about whether it's disease or murder or opioids or car accidents, we can do a lot of things to greatly reduce the numbers, but no one's saying, we expect the number to be zero, and that every time this happens, that is necessarily the fault of a particular individual or institution. And that's something we have to move away from. And, as someone who served on things like the 9/11 Commission, where part of the implicit function was a degree of finger pointing, that is always a danger, and especially because you're often pointing fingers at people who really dedicated their careers to solving a problem, and expecting a degree of perfection from them is unrealistic. I certainly cannot meet that standard, and I don't expect it from people in our government.
I think those are both excellent points, especially moving away from this, the idea of zero risk and the blame game. I oftentimes exit the subway into Union Square in Manhattan, and in Union Square, there's a climate clock that's counting down from 7 years. And at this point, it sort of just goes unnoticed. And, we see climate change all around us, and yet very few people are pointing fingers about that. Yet I know if there were to be a terrorist attack, even one that failed to kill anyone on the subway that I ride, there would be congressional hearings, and there would be finger pointing, and people would use it in political campaigns. And so this is an ugly reality of the domestic politics of the United States, and probably most countries. But I can't help but think that U.S. policymakers in D.C. who are focused on this issue have to at least advocate for us to rise above that, whether it happens anytime soon. I want to bring in a question from the Q&A that talks about this zero/low threat objective that has dominated the way we think about CT over the last 20 years. Somebody asks, can you speak to the extent that which keeping a zero/low threat objective enacted through efforts to disrupt organizations risks undermining the ability to ever have an end by destroying the ability to negotiate with groups and driving the shift to a movement with reduced leader control? Maybe Asfandyar could answer that question, because I know you focused a lot on negotiating with terrorist organizations and also negotiating with the enablers of terrorist organizations such as the Taliban.
I think just on the Taliban piece of it, we should remember that a key component of the Taliban remains designated as a foreign terrorist organization. So the lines between insurgents, political organizations that vie for change through violence and terrorism is not that clear cut. But on this broader issue of finding an off-ramp. I think that's where the USCT community doctrine has really struggled, and perhaps it's a function of the zero tolerance approach. But perhaps part of the problem is also, some of these terrorist groups that we're dealing with. Al-Qaeda betrays no interest in any type of negotiations. It does not offer any kind of political vision that might, provide an opening of talks. I think it's not just the U.S. government. Various regional governments appear to have pondered the possibility of brokering some kind of ceasefire, and some have. There are indications that, for example, Mauritania at one point was able to get a deal with them, but that's about it. So I think there is a degree of, I would say, intolerance towards negotiations with actors like Al-Qaeda. But on the other hand, there is some fault and problem with some of these terror actors as well, which leaves very little in terms of a soft political landing with some of these groups. And in the absence of that, I think we are left with these frameworks of just managing the problem, keeping the threat below a certain level as a steady equilibrium of sorts.
If I could just raise one point, I think it's fine. You're totally correct here. I think the other thing that has happened is the negotiations with the Taliban have badly discredited that line of effort. Unfortunately, the catastrophic outcome of those negotiations have made it very politically difficult for the United States, especially for the current administration, to engage in those kinds of talks. So I also think that, once again, there is a little bit of a political dimension to this as well.
As an active moderator, I guess I'll add something, which is that I think in the case of the talks with the Taliban, they happened because we were losing the conflict in terms of how much resources we're able to put into it. And so I think the talks often get blamed, but the talks were the product of a military policy failure, and our inability to walk away from Afghanistan without getting a negotiated settlement, because it would have been politically untenable to our partners in Kabul or at home. That's my personal
And I'm not arguing about sort of the nature of the negotiations or why we undertook them. I'm saying, as often happens, the policy lesson that was taken from those, given the outcome, has made it very difficult to open up negotiations with other groups. I think there's a lot more nuance to why we engaged in negotiations with the Taliban and why it occurred the way that it did. But the ultimate outcome is one that all Americans saw all over their televisions, and which rarely foreign policy does. So I think that this is an instance where that has had a rebound effect, whether or not it should have or not.
Understood. So that brings up an interesting point. If we're unable to engage in off-ramps by negotiating with terrorists, something that was already very taboo in U.S. foreign policy, and has been made even more taboo by the negotiations with the Taliban, and the end result, as you just explained, we're taken back to a defensive posture. And Dan, you've described the defensive posture as Swiss cheese, in which each tactic we use, for lack of a better word, has holes in it, but in the aggregate, we actually have a pretty solid defensive framework against Al-Qaeda. We only have a few minutes left, and I feel like we could spend another hour on this alone. But Dan, can you explain what you meant when you wrote that there was a Swiss cheese kind of posture?
Sure. So let's think about the 9/11 plot itself, where you had senior leaders in Afghanistan and Pakistan. You had recruits coming from Europe and the Middle East. You had fundraising in the Middle East. You had operations in the United States. You had key meetings in Malaysia and Spain. Today, you would have leaders under tremendous pressure from drone strikes, as Fandir said. It'd be hard for them to communicate. The training and trips to Afghanistan and Pakistan would be exceptionally dangerous. Individuals would be far more likely to be tracked not only by the United States, but by allied intelligence services. they'd be far more likely to work together to share information. Homeland defense agencies in different countries would be stopping people from entering. Every single one of these efforts is going to have some weaknesses, and they won't all succeed. And some terrorists will elude a drone, others will be able to travel under the radar, whether due to luck or a bad particular policy or country. But the odds of catching them at every stage go up dramatically, and that makes doing complex, repeated operations far more difficult. It doesn't stop some chucklehead from picking up a gun and shooting people, but it does make a lot of the operations like Paris or London or Madrid, and of course 9/11, a lot harder.
Trisha, I'd like to bring you in or Asfandyar, if you have a two-finger.
No, I think I agree with Dan on the efficacy of some of these tactics in the aggregate. And my concern, and this gets to Trisha's point, earlier in the conversation about the ongoing right sizing that's underway. My concern is that we might be swinging the pendulum a little bit to the other extreme. For example, the recently drafted national defense strategy doesn't have the word terrorism in it, at least the fact sheet that's been put out. I'm sure there is more language to that effect in the full strategy, but it appears that a major retrenchment is underway. And at the same time, some of the threats are going up, I think, in various regions, as we've been discussing. So my concern is that while this toolkit is very effective and it has delivered some important outcomes, the toolkit might be weakening, and that would be that's an undesirable counterterrorism outcome.
Trisha, where do you think would be the right balance for the toolkit? And since you've done so much work on terrorist leadership, how important is disrupting the leadership of terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda to deterring a future attack? I think perhaps to the layman who observes these organizations, it looks like a revolving door in which you eliminate one leader and all of a sudden there's another one, and who cares? But maybe it's very important. So can you inform us?
Sure. And I in this case, I again agree with both Dan and Asfandyar that we have a pretty robust toolkit. But as we diversify our attention and focus on other things, there is, I think, a danger of some of the toolkit being weakened. So I do agree with both of those points. On the leadership question, I would say that, overall, the most important leader for these organizations is the founding one. And very few organizations still have their founding leaders at this point. But we do see a number of cases where a new leader coming in can rejuvenate an organization that was lagging. We talked a lot about how al-Qaeda in Iraq was lagging under Zarqawi's successors, only to make a resurgence. And there's a lot of talk about how Zawahiri is a little bit of a lackluster leader, but what we call him is a caretaker. He sort of maintained the organization while it's been besieged, but there is always the potential for a more dynamic kind of visionary leader to come after that kind of caretaker leader. And it can seem like it's a revolving door, but it also can be a key part of rebuilding an organization. It won't do it alone, but it can have an inspiring effect on organizations when a sort of visionary leader comes in at a critical time. So I wouldn't place too much emphasis on leaders, but I would say they can be very important, especially at the beginning and when a group is trying to rebuild, if the right leader comes into play.
Okay, thanks for that, Trisha. I think we have maybe 2 minutes left, and I'm going to try to do an exercise in brevity, which I know nobody who focuses on policy wants to do. But if in 30 seconds, each of you could give your 30,000-foot advice to the Biden administration on how to manage the al-Qaeda risk. I'm going to start with Asfandyar because he might have to run, then Trisha, then Dan. Try to keep it to 30 seconds if you can for the sake of this, and let's go.
My advice really is to stop framing CT as a either or thing, that something that need not be done, and strategic competition needs to be the only thing that the administration should focus on. I think it is important to focus more on strategic competition as well as some of the other issues we've discussed, but it's important to concurrently maintain some of the CT gains of the past few years and continue with the investments, in particular in areas that have worked. So that would be my advice.
My very quick advice would be that the last 20 years with counterterrorism as the top priority, we got used to having abundant resources to do this mission. And there has to be an adjustment to be able to do as much as possible with far less resources and to be more effective in our ability to do so, even when there are other top priorities that the US has to manage.
So I think Tricia and Esfandiar both raised important points, and I will simply add that as we're adjusting the resources to focus on other priorities, recognize that this may expose the United States and especially its allies to more risk. And that's something that needs to be factored in as we're thinking about overall policy.
Okay, well, you all really stuck to the 30-second rule. Maybe it's because at least two of you are used to briefing people in government who probably have limited attention spans. But thank you for that. And thanks to all of you for joining the panel today. And I'm always left on this topic thinking we need about 2 more hours. If you haven't read the War on the Rocks piece in which Dan and Esfandiar debate, you should do that. If you have more patience and focus, then you can read their studies, their journal article on studies in conflict and terrorism, assessing al-Qaeda, a debate. It's about 40 pages, but it gets much more nuanced. Do look out for Tricia's book on terrorist leadership that's coming out in September. And maybe we'll have you back, Tricia, to discuss that book. So thanks everyone for joining today, and especially the panelists.